The decision to create American mountain troops was, in its essence, an admission of strategic failure. American soldiers, trained mostly for warm-weather combat, were utterly unprepared for the world's most formidable terrain. Inspired by the audacious success of Finnish ski troops against the Red Army, the US Army was forced into a desperate game of catch-up with German forces who already fielded multiple specialized mountain divisions. Minidole's relentless advocacy, backed by detailed reports from military observers like David Bradley, finally broke through the bureaucratic inertia. The call for specialized troops drew an improbable mix of talent: wealthy ski bums, college athletes, and European expatriates who had escaped occupied countries all signed up. Men like Dennis Noonan, a former IBM desk jockey, joined not to prove his manhood, but simply to protect his country. This elite, idealized group was quickly shipped west to Camp Hale, Colorado, dedicated in June of 1942. The construction project itself was immense, costing nearly $400,000 just for the access road. The camp was built to handle 15,000 men, 5,000 mules, and 200 dogs, but the valley floor was a subarctic swamp for much of the year, and the thin air was quickly poisoned. The pervasive soot from coal stoves and trains earned the valley a grim moniker, the land of black snow. Men developed the Pando Hack, a chronic cough caused by the airborne soot. This cough hospitalized 1,700 men and forced countless others to transfer out. The stark, jagged peaks surrounding them were a constant reminder of nature's lethal power, contrasting sharply with the polluted, unhealthy air they breathed in the valley. The tension between the unit's specialized purpose and traditional military thinking was immediate and deep. Men like Noonan, who had only ever climbed to the top of a Fifth Avenue bus, arrived alongside world-class experts like Charles McLean, an early captain of Dartmouth's ski team, and Ernst Engel, the Austrian escapee who had coached skiing at Cornell. The army, however, was led by men like Lieutenant Colonel Onslow Rolfe, who had learned to ski only the previous year and expressed his ambivalence openly.
"You men seem to have the idea that you're ski troops," Rolfe told them bluntly.
Well, you aren't. He insisted they were mountain troops, and anyone who knew anything about the high country knew they required mules to carry the equipment. The reliance on machines failed quickly in the high country. Mules proved superior to jeeps, their intelligence and sure-footedness essential for carrying heavy loads even through shelling. Rolfe defended his pack animals fiercely, though the mule skinners were a rowdy lot. Dennis Noonan observed they made more noise than an L train during a bombing raid. Recruits were pushed through 8 weeks of intensive military ski school, 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. This was followed by a 5-day mountaineering program covering navigation and map reading. They mastered specialized rope techniques like piton belays and Tyrolean traverses, essential for moving heavy weapons and gear up impossibly steep rock faces. Despite the skill infused by world-class instructors like Herbert Schneider and Tony Matt, a deep debate persisted about the unit's true focus. Colonel Carl Steenerson cautioned Dole that German authorities prioritized efficiency, believing that 99% of military skiing was cross-country skiing, and they would not allow their troops to waste months on play skiing. The rigorous training often felt undermined by poor leadership. Noonan noted bitterly that the young officers have no idea on handling men. He worried that the morale seemed to be getting lower daily, placing the fault squarely on management. Soldiers endured idiotic drills and grueling hikes where the pace was sped up only on the way home. Standard-issue boots quickly failed, and the relentless cold seeped into their bones, leading to debilitating trench foot. Meanwhile, the public saw only the idealized image in giddy articles celebrating these young men as if they were explorers. Headlines proclaimed that none but real he-men need apply. This romantic vision masked the brutal reality of their preparations. Expeditions on Mount McKinley, led by climbers like Walter Wood and Bob Bates, tested experimental gear. Sleeping bags failed catastrophically at 24 degrees below zero, and a pressure cooker exploded. Yet, these tests proved the feasibility of equipping troops for extreme cold. The development of the Weasel over Snow vehicle promised technological superiority. But for the men of the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, the reality was a constant struggle against nature, the anxiety of avalanches, and the pervasive sense that the camp itself was becoming a prison. They learned that the constant companion to both the mountaineer and the soldier was fear, a profound tension between exaltation on the slopes and the panic of impending chaos. The romantic substitute for the millions of Americans who would never see the front lines was about to face the relentless death and fear that the war had begun dropping on their doorstep. The public's romantic vision of the mountain warrior was annihilated by the reality of the Colorado Crucible. The most dramatic collapse came during the Homestake Maneuvers in February of 1943. This exercise became a catastrophic metaphor for the disastrous retreat from Moscow. 12,000 men were ordered to carry 90-pound packs to altitudes of 13,000 feet through 8 feet of snow. Blizzards blew horizontal snow across the peaks, and the temperatures plunged to the coldest point of the season. The pace was brutal, a relentless 106 steps per minute. The men were driven past the point of endurance. Earl Clark, caught in the white fury, felt his snowblindness flare up. He described the agony as hot pokers in his sockets, radiating through his scalp, a consequence of having loaned his goggles to a fellow soldier. In one company, Captain Hugh Evans watched his men break down, their exhaustion palpable. When his captain ordered an impossible pace up Resolution Road toward Ptarmigan Pass, Evans openly defied him, refusing to push his exhausted men further. The defiance cost Evans his rank, but it earned him the profound, visceral respect of his soldiers. They knew a non-commissioned officer often stood between the devil and the deep blue sea. The physical cost of this mismanagement was staggering. The maneuvers resulted in 195 cases of frostbite, 340 injuries, and nearly 1,400 cases of sickness, 5 times the usual rate for other divisions. Soldiers, desperate to escape the relentless pace, lined up for 15 blocks hoping for sick leave. Some were so desperate they smashed their own feet with rifles just to earn a ticket out. Major Walter Wood, an advisor from the Alpine Club, had cautioned against such dangerous maneuvers. The fallout was swift and decisive. Minnie Dole, the tireless advocate, wrote a scathing report on the inadequate management, and Lieutenant Colonel Rolfe, the camp commander, was quickly relieved of his command. Organizational change followed quickly. The unit became the 10th Light Division, a specialized force of 13,000 men. Crucially, it included 500 foreign-born soldiers whose expertise in high-altitude movement was desperately needed. But the absurdity continued to mount. Just as they had finally mastered the bitter cold, the division was abruptly ordered to conduct swamp maneuvers in the humid heat of Texas. Dennis Noonan was infuriated by the change of scenery. He wrote home simply, "They can give this place back to Mexico." The troops endured overwhelming heat, swarms of biting insects, and water that tasted flat and oily. Men broke out with boils, severe heat rash, and impetigo. They were training for a war that felt a million miles from the snow-capped glory they had originally enlisted to fight. This sense of bewilderment deepened further with their first taste of deployment. One regiment was shipped directly to the Aleutian Islands, a destination that immediately felt like a curse. Aboard the troopship, the soldiers were tossed violently in their bunks as the massive vessel bellied through the hungry ocean waves. Below deck, the air was thick and stale, illuminated only by the eerie glow from wall-mounted boxes of fire hoses. This atmosphere was punctuated by the relentless vibration of the propeller and the dull, shocking burst of a depth charge. That sound was a constant reminder of Japanese submarines lurking just beneath the surface of the hungry ocean. The men landed first on Adak and then on Kiska, islands notorious for their unchangingly terrible weather. The terrain was a great green sponge of slopes that rose steeply to a rocky knife-edge crest, nearly 800 feet above the shore, often lost in the perpetual fog. Movement was a muddy misery, and the mud was so deep that even heavy bulldozers often got immovably stuck. The wind was a knockdown, deafening force, and the ocean was the bleak color of gunmetal. Noonan, writing to his mother, shared the grim pragmatism required for survival on the front. He told her, "They told us on Adak that the going would be tough, that some of us were going to drown in surf, and if we didn't get it, we'd see our friends and comrades drop." They were preparing for a massive assault against an estimated 10,000 Japanese troops. The operation carried an anticipated 20% overall casualty rate. Rumors whispered that the risk was 80% for the specific regiment involved. The tension was agonizing, and the future felt agonizingly uncertain. Yet when 34,000 Allied troops landed on August 15, 1943, expecting the fiercest resistance, they found only a treeless, barren rock. The Japanese, led by Admiral Kimura, had executed a brilliant clandestine evacuation entirely by submarine, concealed by the heavy fog. This immense invasion turned instantly into a masterclass in surreal anticlimax. Allied intelligence, fueled by the pervasive fear of the enemy, had vastly overestimated the force opposing them. The constant mist and fog immediately led to terrifying moments of friendly fire. Private First Class Murray de Camp Spear, his carbine jammed and useless, was accidentally shot by his own sleeping comrade in the confusion. Major Robert Works narrowly avoided being shot by his own nervous men in the impenetrable blinding soup of the fog. The island was empty, but the war still relentlessly claimed American lives. The psychological toll was devastating. The men were trapped in a grueling green nightmare of constant dampness, darkness, and crushing monotony, suffering what they called the Kiska Blues. They survived on abandoned canned beef and bathed using their helmets as basins. Noonan captured the bitter disillusionment perfectly, realizing that some campaigns end in loneliness amidst sand, mud, fog, or rain, rather than in a blaze of glory. Noonan knew that the one thing the military hated was an idle private, because if he thought long enough he might realize the profound absurdity of his situation. The disastrous dry run of Kiska and the strategic blunders then unfolding in Italy finally forced the army's hand. The need for specialized troops was no longer theoretical, it was an urgent necessity. The division, now officially designated the 10th Mountain Division, received a new commander, General George P. Hayes. General Hayes, unlike his predecessor, genuinely understood the men he commanded. He addressed his officers and non-commissioned officers with profound appreciation. Hayes said, "I thought what a fine-looking body of men they were, and how lucky I was to get command of such a fine division." He immediately instituted a new policy focused entirely on morale. His goal was making men as comfortable and to have as good a time as possible, provided they accomplished their core missions. The long-awaited deployment order finally came. The men boarded troop ships like the USS Argentina, packed in so tightly they felt melted and poured in. Enlisted men slept sitting up during the long train journeys required to reach the embarkation points. Dan Kennedy, traveling across the country on Christmas Eve 1944, missed seeing his family by mere hours, a poignant near encounter that underscored the sacrifice. The mountains of Italy, which General Kesselring called his last hard bone, were waiting. The men of the 10th Mountain Division, forged in soot and blizzards, tempered by friendly fire in the blinding fog, were finally heading to the place where their unique, hard-won skills would be desperately needed. The voyage across the Atlantic was a study in profound discomfort. It was a transition from the land of black snow to the grim, salt-laced reality of war. Aboard the troop ships, the air was foul and heavy, caused by severe overcrowding. Men felt like they were crossing the Atlantic in a submarine, with heavy rolling waves inducing debilitating seasickness. The relentless vibration from the ship's propeller was a constant, maddening aggravation to their nerves. Dennis Noonan found his nerves frayed by the intense confinement and the sheer volume of humanity surrounding him. This was certainly not the heroic expedition described in Life magazine articles. It was a grueling passage toward what felt like a cursed and forgotten war. When the nearly 14,000 soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division disembarked in Naples in late 1944, they were met not with glory, but with utter devastation. German forces had left sunken ships everywhere in the harbour. The city itself bore the grim scars of a country fighting desperately to free itself from hostile occupation. German leaflets, scattered across the docks, taunted the arriving troops with the proverb, "Vedi Napoli e poi muon," see Naples and die. The leaflets issued a chilling warning. This is not Camp Hale, where you had 15,000 men skiing. The reality of the Italian campaign was a brutal attritional struggle, far removed from the soft underbelly of Europe once envisioned by Allied planners. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army had been bogged down for months, fighting a bloody and ambivalent slog against General Albert Kesselring's masterful defense. Kesselring had employed hundreds of concrete machine gun pillboxes, tank turrets housing 88mm guns, and thousands of landmines to create seemingly impregnable defenses along the Gothic line. The peninsula's relentless waves of mountain chains offered the German defenders a profound geological advantage. If one defense line was broken, another mountain defense always waited just beyond. The strategic missteps were painfully evident in the costly failures that had preceded the arrival of the 10th Division. The push through Casino alone had resulted in over 52,000 Allied casualties against less than 38,000 German losses, yielding no significant advance. The crossing of the Rapido River in January 1940-4 had become a disaster, earning it the grim moniker, the Bloody River. Allied command had fatally relied on conventional infantry tactics, trying to bull its way up the main roads against entrenched positions. General George Marshall, later confessing the crucial need for mountain troops in Italy, understood the fatal oversight. The assumption that soldiers are soldiers, no matter what, was a deadly premise in this specific theatre of war. The mountain division was thrown immediately into the grim psychological reality of the front lines. The initial combat was jarring and overwhelming. Edward Nickerson recalled the overwhelming stench of cordite, which, in his extraordinary ignorance, he initially confused with the smell of dead bodies. That acrid, smoky smell quickly overwhelmed the familiar odor of sweaty leather belts, other leather gear, and heavy, unwashed woolen uniforms. The first casualties were startling, senseless, and deeply wasteful. They included 7 enlisted men and a Catholic chaplain, all killed by a single mine explosion. The German defenders, in their fastidious withdrawal, had left behind a horrific trail of destruction. They had booby-trapped everything imaginable, from abandoned civilian homes to sacred churches. By December 1944, the Allied effort had ground to a halt. They were staring up at 33 Axis divisions dug into the last hard bone of the northern Apennine Mountains. General George P. Hayes recognized that every defensive position in the mountains had a keystone. That objective was Mount Belvedere. But Belvedere was protected by Riva Ridge, a dramatic 5.5-mile escarpment of fractured limestone cliffs. These cliffs rose nearly 5,000 feet into the air. General Lucien Truscott, commander of the Fifth Army, expressed his doubts and frustrations. He deemed the cliffs impossible to climb, calling them like a stiff palm. A hard freeze and a blanketing snowfall had made the already friable cliffs impossibly slick. Hayes, however, saw the impossibility as their key advantage. The German defenders considered the cliffs impregnable and had therefore left them lightly defended. The only way to smash the linchpin of the German army's lines was an audacious nighttime assault on Riva Ridge. This attack would leverage the mountain division's unique, hard-won climbing skills. The troops were rushed to the front, too late for extensive ski training, and immediately faced a critical shortage of specialized mountain warfare equipment. Despite years of testing at Camp Hale, there was a shocking lack of proper mountain boots, sleeping bags, skis, and most critically crampons. Soldiers were forced to improvise, knotting ropes into simple creepers for footing on the treacherous icy slopes. They were already under acute psychological pressure, dealing with sleeplessness and the pervasive cold that seeped into their bones. They were resigned to the inevitable snafus of military supply. The mountain itself became the enemy. Bob Frausen, leading a dangerous scouting mission, moved his men in the shadows beneath the ridge, clinging to the dark. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hampton felt as if his men were moving around the bottom of a bowl, with the enemy sitting on 2/3 of the rim. The intelligence was fatally flawed. Initial estimates suggested only 3 German positions on Riva Ridge. Reconnaissance later revealed 18 positions, plus at least 4 observation posts. The plan was set: multiple staggered climbing routes to maintain surprise and avoid direct frontal assaults. On Friday, February 16th, General Hayes addressed his men, declaring them the finest troops I have ever been associated with. His orders were stark, a chilling mantra for the coming violence. Continue to move forward. Never stop.
Always forward.
Always forward. Always forward. If your buddy is wounded, do not stop to help him. Continue to move forward. Always forward. He told them the anticipated casualty rate was a grim 90%, a number mercifully withheld from the soldiers. The men were promised relief within 24 hours, an underestimation of vast proportions. The air was thick with tension. Dan Kennedy, the machine gunner, watched the preparations. Assault platoons were organized, armed with riflemen carrying 96 rounds of ammunition. Carbine carriers had extra boxes, and machine gunners lugged thousands of rounds. 30 small mules and a porter platoon were tasked with hauling 50-caliber machine guns and 75mm pack howitzers up the cliffs. The troops of the 10th, having seen their faith in technology betrayed by exploded pressure cookers and failed sleeping bags, had to rely on the one thing they had come to trust: They relied on their instincts in rough country. The assault began in earnest on the morning of Sunday, February 18th. The troops waded through ankle-deep mud, battling a thick fog that covered the ground. They were forced to peer into the soup and strain to see even their own men. The trail was tangled with brush, the footing terrible, particularly in the dark. The slope was so steep and the darkness so complete that every odd stone, every misshapen tree, became the silhouette of a German soldier. Without sleeping bags, soldiers relied on wool blankets, pairing off to share body heat for warmth in the biting cold. The constant fear of a loud slip being disastrous echoed with every crunch of boots over snow and every clatter of rucksacks against rocks. The men were climbing Riva Ridge, the keystone to the German defense, in a gamble against terrain and human endurance. This desperate move would either shatter Kesselring's line or shatter the 10th Mountain Division itself. The clock stopped at 2300 hours on the night of February 18th. The air was impossibly cold, the temperature dropping several degrees below freezing. The sweat beneath the men's woolen uniforms instantly became clammy ice. They were high on the fractured limestone cliffs of Riva Ridge. General Truscott had deemed this 5.5-mile escarpment impossible to climb, especially with the hard freeze and a blanketing snowfall making the surface impossibly slick. This was the keystone, the linchpin, and the men of the 10th Mountain Division, their faces smeared with white grease paint against the snow, were now moving through a silence more terrifying than any barrage. Dennis Noonan, the former IBM desk jockey who had survived the absurd anticlimax of Kiska, moved with the lead climbing platoon of the 86th Regiment. He felt the long strain of silent movement, the breathless waits, enduring the physical punishment of alternately sweating up the rough terrain and lying motionless for hours on the snow. He was freezing in his own icy sweat. The only sound was the muffled thump-thump of his heart against the cold stone and the faint grating scrape of improvised rope creepers against the ice. The plan was audacious. Avoid the well-defended frontal positions and scale the sheer near-vertical cliffs the Germans believed offered perfect security. Noonan's group was following Trail Number 3, a route scouted by Lieutenant John McCown and Lieutenant Gordon Anderson. Their weapons were unloaded, the strict order for a silent assault paramount. Surprise was their only defense against the 90% casualty rate that command secretly anticipated. Then, the moment arrived. Around midnight, the lead climbers' men who had learned piton belays and Tyrolean traverses, not for sport, but for this exact, murderous purpose, reached the first German position. It was an observation post carved into the rock face. There was no time for warning, no sound other than the sudden, sharp intake of breath from a German sentry. The sentry had been, astonishingly, asleep or simply complacent in the belief that the cliff was impregnable. The fight was instant, brutal, and silent. Knives and climbing axes were the first weapons used. The men, relying on the instinctive, murderous violence that had been drilled into them at Camp Hale, lunged into the small dugout. The shock of the German defenders was absolute. They were caught cleaning their weapons, perhaps playing cards, certainly not expecting Americans to appear, ghost-like, from the vertical blackness below. The air in the confined space instantly filled with the metallic scent of blood and the desperate grunts of close-quarters combat. Noonan, coming up behind the initial wave, heard a sickening, choked cry. The sound was cut short by a heavy blow. Then came the rapid, quiet movement of bodies being dragged into the deeper shadows. Within minutes, the first position was secured. The German defenders had been relying entirely on the mountain to fight for them, and the mountain had just betrayed them. As the ridge began to fill with American troops scaling the 5 distinct routes, the silence could not hold. A burst of automatic fire erupted from a position further down the ridge, signaling that surprise was fading. The men, now scrambling across the summit in the blackness, loaded their weapons. The pinging of small arms fire and the explosion of German grenades became the new, terrifying soundtrack. By 1:30 a.m. on the 19th, the climbing troops had secured the ridgeline. Riva Ridge, the supposedly impregnable keystone, was theirs. This immediate success, however, was only the prelude to the main event. General Hayes had used the division's unique skills to smash the linchpin of the German defense. But the main target, Mount Belvedere, that big, grassy, sloped hill, wooded heavily at the top, remained fiercely defended. The 10th Mountain Division did not rest on its laurels. They immediately wheeled their assault toward Belvedere, shifting the entire operation from vertical stealth to horizontal, grinding brutality. Dan Kennedy, the machine gunner, woke up shivering in his position below Mount Belvedere, hours before dawn on February 19th. He recalled the initial orders that had caused him profound, cynical disbelief. He remembered thinking, "Man alive, we are to make an assault with 5 battalions against the strongest German positions in Italy and not a goddamn loaded gun in the entire outfit." Now the guns were very much loaded indeed. The fight for Belvedere immediately became a close-quarters slugging match against tenacious German resistance, dug deep into concrete pillboxes. The air quickly became thick with dirt, flying rocks, powder, and smoke. Kennedy, caught in the wake of the advance, inhaled a smell that took him a few sickening moments to recognize: a slaughterhouse. What he was smelling, plainly, was blood. He watched men fall in a minefield, their lower halves ripped apart, revealing the grim reality of the German defenses. The fighting was especially fierce on Mount Gorgolesco, a subsidiary peak. As dawn approached on the 20th, Hugh Evans' company neared the summit, facing some 30 German gun positions. Evans, despite his earlier bust in rank, emerged as a figure of extraordinary bravery. He pushed forward, a lone figure against the enemy line, capturing 8 men and seemingly causing others to flee. His actions were a desperate, visceral attempt to break the stalemate. His friend Sergeant Bob Fisher died on Gorgolesco. His last words are whispered, "Oh God, please not now, please not now."
The Americans were fighting a war where the enemy violated every convention of combat.
Howard Koch, leading C Company on Ridge X, watched German soldiers feign surrender only to open fire. This treacherous act unnerved the American soldiers and cost Private William Godwin his life with a bullet to the head. But the 10th Mountain Division was now fully engaged, and their momentum was overwhelming. The engineers, working with astonishing speed, became the division's logistical saviors. Lieutenant Bill McGuckin watched in awe as they constructed a 1.5-mile road and a 1,500-foot aerial tramway in a single 11-hour day. This vital lifeline began hauling 11 tons of food and ammunition up the mountain, dramatically improving the ability to evacuate casualties. The fight continued to Mount della Torraccia. The combat here was apocalyptic. Artillery fire caused deep craters, and trees burst into flame all around them. The largest German shells encountered were from 170mm cannons, their impact shaking the very bedrock of the mountain. Stuart Abbott, the young naturalist in L Company, who was more interested in cataloguing trees than fighting, was killed on Gorgolesco. His death was described by a comrade as merciful as death can be. The constant anxiety and the psychological toll were immense. Soldiers wanted to pull their helmets down over their knees to escape the singing shrapnel, the musical shrapnel that filled the air. Dan Kennedy's nerves were frayed. A scare in a minefield, which turned out to be only pine needles, highlighted the sensory confusion of sustained combat. The grim reality of battlefield morality surfaced when soldiers attempted to take a wedding ring from a dead German soldier, prompting another soldier to mutter, "Damn grave robber." By the night of March 3rd, after relentless high-casualty fighting, the American regiment captured Mount della Torraccia. The audacious assault on Riva Ridge and the brutal, sustained fight for Mount Belvedere had broken the German line irrevocably. General Hayes's gamble had paid off. The Gothic line, the linchpin of Kesselring's defense, was smashed, and the path to the Po River Valley, the long-sought strategic objective, was finally open. The cost was staggering, a total of nearly 1,800 casualties in their short campaign. But they had proven their worth, turning the tide in a theatre that had swallowed conventional forces whole. The breakthrough at Mount Belvedere shattered the stubborn stalemate of the Italian campaign. For the 10th Mountain Division, the war transformed from a brutal, vertical grind into a rapid horizontal pursuit. This was Operation Great Shot, the final Allied offensive launched in the first week of April 1945. The division transitioned instantly from scaling cliffs to driving across the Po River Valley. They faced a German defense that, while crumbling, remained fanatical and lethal, desperately guarding the valley's resources, food and supplies. The offensive began with an hour of unimaginable noise on April 14th, the day after President Roosevelt's death cast a somber shadow over the advance. 40 minutes of preparatory bombardment, followed by 30 minutes of heavy artillery attack, 2,000 guns firing over 33,000 shells, turned the landscape into a boiling inferno. Dan Kennedy watched the barrage, the cynical thought crossing his mind. Man, the taxpayers are sure catching hell today. As the rolling thunder lifted, the infantry advanced, but the ground itself was still laced with death. Engineers worked around the clock to dismantle 3,000 mines in 36 hours. Their casualty lists were often as long as the infantry's, facing tripwire configurations, glass-topped mines, and deep holes filled with dynamite. The psychological toll was immense. Dennis Noonan found himself perpetually trembling like a leaf when caught in an artillery barrage. He dug into the earth with all the speed and strength he could summon, sweating and praying for soft digging. He woke from dreams of home to the cold, shameful realization that he had urinated in his sleeping bag. War, he knew, was more of a mental strain, because the enemy was always trying his darndest to kill you, no matter if you are in a foxhole or tending to the call of nature. The grim reality of their advance was punctuated by the sight of friends killed by booby traps. It was also marked by the profound, scarring experience of being ordered to execute German prisoners. The fighting was close and desperate. During the advance on Pra del Bianco, Larry Kohler was killed by German fire. His body was later displayed, hanging from a roofless building, a macabre sight that fueled the rage of his comrades. In a moment of targeted revenge, a soldier named Putnam, who had witnessed his men killed, led a team using Panzerfausts, the German armor punch, to drive a mailed fist right into the heart of Pra del Bianco. They destroyed the small town in a violent, cathartic spasm. On Hill 909, 19-year-old John McGrath, a former Boy Scout leader, performed extraordinary acts of bravery. He single-handedly captured a machine gun nest and numerous Germans. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor, but the memory of his final, paradoxical words, "I've been having fun," was a chilling counterpoint to the carnage he had wrought. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Robert Dole, a young replacement officer described by his men as a pretty cool, fair guy, led a platoon pinned down in an open field on Hill 913. He was severely wounded, his appearance grey, the way they got before they died. Medics were gunned down attempting to reach him. Sergeant Edward Carafa crawled across the battlefield to pull Dole to safety, marking his forehead with a scarlet M in blood to indicate he had received morphine. The relentless pace of the advance, though incredibly costly, ultimately overwhelmed the German forces. General Frido von Senger watched his retreat, admitting he no longer entertained any hope of again having a combat-ready force at his disposal south of the Po River. By the time the division reached that massive waterway, they had captured approximately 4,000 prisoners. The crossing of the Po River became a strategic objective achieved through sheer, frantic improvisation. General Robinson Duff's advanced task force reached the river on April 23rd. But the critical assault boats were tragically inadequate, small paddle boats that could hold only 10 men. Soldiers were forced to use their rifle butts to paddle across the 200-yard expanse. The advance was a surreal experience, the troops commandeering vehicles and resembling a band of heavily armed gypsies. They passed constant wreckage and the German dead strewn across the landscape. Kennedy, his nerves frayed by the chaos, began questioning orders, thinking they were going to get someone killed because some fat-ass rear-echelon colonel thought up a harebrained idea. But the true, unvarnished horror of the war was revealed not by the desperate fighting, but by the liberation of the concentration camps. As the Allied forces pushed north, they suddenly encountered the ghastliness of exactly what the men had been fighting for. The familiar, emblematic odor of the German soldier, a strange mix between damp earth and a new puppy, was utterly eclipsed. It was replaced by the unspeakable, overwhelming stench of Nazi atrocities. Soldiers discovered freight cars stacked high with whip-scarred dead. They witnessed the smooth efficiency of the crematories. Worst of all, they saw evidence of the starving cutting out hearts and livers just to survive. This revelation profoundly altered the soldiers' understanding of their struggle, transforming it instantly from a tactical fight for terrain into a confrontation with pure evil. The final, bizarre chapter of the campaign unfolded around Lake Garda. The strategic objective was to secure the lake, which the Germans intended to use as their last redoubt. The troops were met by cheering Italians offering flowers and wine at the southern end. But the celebratory mood turned ominous as they neared the German-held north. At a roadblock south of Garda town, K Company was suddenly pinned down by a storm of high-velocity, armor-piercing shells. These rounds were fired from German 88mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed for ground combat. The German defenders had destroyed 5 road tunnels ahead of the advance, forcing a high-risk decision to bypass the obstacles. This required using primitive DUKWs and requisitioned fishing boats. General Hayes watched in horror as these clumsy boats became sitting ducks on the open water. Shells created massive geysers that soared 50 feet high. In one of the tunnels, the Germans achieved a 1-in-a-million shot. A shell exploded inside the confined space. The resulting blast pressure ripped out of both ends, sending lethal waves of stone shards and shell fragments ricocheting off the walls. Bob Carlson walked through the resulting smoke and dust, having to step over the arms and legs and dismembered bodies of these people who had just been blown to bits. The advance, somehow, continued. Edward Nickerson led his squad on a 17-mile hike, culminating in the capture of Villa Feltrinelli. This was Mussolini's sprawling 37-room retreat. Jean Hames, a soldier who grew up in a house without running water or electricity, curled up and slept soundly in Mussolini's well-appointed bed, a moment of striking, surreal contrast. The war's end was truly imminent. The surrender ceremony for all German armies in southwestern Europe took place on May 4th, yet the final moments were still punctuated by tragedy. Colonel William Darby, the legendary founder of the Army Rangers, was killed by a random shell just before the cessation of hostilities. It was a stark reminder of war's final, arbitrary cruelty. The 10th Mountain Division had suffered nearly 5,000 casualties in only 4 short months of fighting, a devastating contrast to their endless months of training. They had defied the notion that their niche skills were anachronistic, proving that specialized mountain expertise was vital for breaking the formidable Gothic line. For the survivors, the war's end brought a complex mix of relief and profound grief. Dan Kennedy, looking out over the lake's magnificent lobe of deep mountain water, felt overwhelmed that he had survived, but he was simultaneously washed over with sorrow for his fallen comrades. Dennis Noonan lamented his quiet departure from Italy, unable to say goodbye to the girl he had met. He wondered what she thought when she woke and burst out of her door to find no soldiers left in town. The true, enduring legacy of these rugged but irreverent, strong but smart men began not with their victory in Italy, but with their immediate return home.
They dispersed deep into the country's mountain ranges.
Eager to put their hard-won competence to work, they established over 60 major ski resorts, including the iconic Aspen and Vale. They pioneered avalanche science and modern rescue techniques. They founded essential institutions like the National Outdoor Leadership School and championed wilderness conservation across the West. The 10th Mountain Division Trail and Hut System, encompassing 300 miles, stands today as a living testament to their enduring connection to the mountains they had so expertly conquered. Their impact on the American landscape and the national identity of outdoor recreation would ultimately prove more profound than their combat record, transforming the crucible of war into a permanent legacy of spirited integrity. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories for future generations, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.